Without further ado, to wrap up the Smart City track, we are joined with a great panel lineup of industry-leading smart city and digital government practitioners. We have with us Najib Ibrahim, the Managing Director of Cyberview, which is mandated by the Malaysian government in spearheading the development of Cyberjaya to a global tech hub. Our next guest panelist is a Principal Assistant Director at the Digital Government Division of the Malaysian Administrative Modernisation and Management Planning Unit, MAMPU. She is Dr. Rosida Razak. Dialing in all the way from Brisbane, Australia is our special guest from the Smart City Council of Australia, New Zealand, Mr. Adam Beck. And rejoining the panel is Mr. David Rajoo from Palo Alto Networks Malaysia and Mike Graham of PwC Malaysia, who will be moderating the panel discussion this time. Well, this is definitely a great public and private and country-to-country collaboration at its finest. Before we continue, the panel is going to get ready, so please stay tuned. We will be back in just a short while.
So good morning, and to wrap up the Smart City track, as Mira suggested, we were represented with a series of panelists, all with a view of talking about articulating the future, which plays to the whole smart city conversation. It plays to the security conversation. It plays to the policymaker conversation. But before we go into anything, what I would like to do is just link the conversation. I think the question that Mindy asked during the presentation I gave a half an hour ago or so was the risk, perhaps, if I use my own words to describe her question. And Adam, I'll start with this. I'll particularly start with you on this one. Is there a risk that the smart city agenda widens the gap between urban and non-urban areas? And what is it people can do to perhaps bridge that gap?
Mike, thanks for that question. I believe it's a really important one, and one that has certainly been stress tested in 2020, particularly as a result of the COVID health pandemic. I think there is certainly a real risk that the smart cities agenda does become not only a polarizing agenda, but one that is not for all, regardless of geography and socioeconomic status. If we don't be more diligent in tying it back to outcomes and priorities. There are certainly perceptions that it is a big city, metro city agenda that is full of technology deployments and the use of data platforms that are very costly. That is often the perception that comes with the smart cities agenda. What I will say, however, and what does hearten me, is that year on year, we are finding examples and case studies and use cases whereby technology and data is helping build prosperity for our most vulnerable. And I think that that's when we're getting to a place where this is an agenda that is certainly outcomes driven. And if we're not creating change and adding value and creating impact for our most vulnerable, regardless of geography, urban, rural, regional, I don't think it's an agenda that is going to last. So I am cautiously optimistic, and we are seeing more and more signs of where technology and data is playing a role in delivering value, not just in big cities, but also in rural and regional areas as well, and indeed with some of our most vulnerable communities in the population.
Yeah, I think the word vulnerable really resonates with me. Thank you, Adam. And David, just fresh off the back of your presentation, thank you for joining us as well.
Thanks.
We talked in advance of this particular panel session about the vulnerable in terms of security. Yeah. Is there a risk in that sort of divide concept that actually those that are not looked after become increasingly exposed?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, right? I mean, smart city, I think it's an amazing opportunity to really think about, I guess, narrowing that digital divide, right? And making sure that we are including those populations or those communities that are now, increasingly going to be accessing the net. And I think it almost becomes a responsibility for the city or even an infrastructure provider to make sure that security is literally baked into the service itself, right? And it's because the community, the vulnerable community coming online, getting access to technologies and services, they will be excited in getting onto this, right? And at time and time we've seen again that the bad actors will very well take advantage of this and now try to figure out what's the best way to kind of take advantage of these citizens or this set of users that's coming online, right? So I think it almost becomes, it is actually our responsibility to make sure that Smart City has got the security piece of it that's built in. And I hate to say it, right? Not as a bolt-on after effect, which we have seen, and I've seen it in the past decade, that security has always been a bolt-on afterthought kind of thing. So building security, and not only from a technology perspective, probably other panelists will talk about it, from a policy perspective, from a process perspective as well, it's going to be critical to make sure that we have a thriving smart city.
So, with Cyberview, Ibrahim, the Petri dish, perhaps, that combines Adam's point about looking after the vulnerable, that really thinks through David's point around, an afterthought of security. How do you, perhaps just give us a couple of sentences on Cyberview, the mission, what you're planning, and how you might respond to some of those challenges.
All right. Thank you, Michael. So by the way, I'm Najib from Cyberview Sdn Bhd. We are the master developer of Cyberjaya. So our approach with regards to smart city implementation strategy actually involve a three-pronged approach. First and foremost is that we prioritizing inclusivity, also being citizen-centric. Secondly, enabling and digitalizing all services. Last but not least, that ensuring that our smart city is open and collaborative. So this is basically what we implemented in Cyberjaya. And this strategies includes executable programs that we implemented throughout Cyberjaya. And these programs actually drive technology innovation in Cyberjaya and truly make our city as a living lab for our homegrown technology. And our current smart city framework is designed to be holistic enough, including the following components, pretty much in the form of smart infrastructure, smart economy, smart environment, and also smart social. While rolling out the smart city solution in these priority areas, we do need to collaborate with other agencies, and be able to empower and participate citizen, business, and other stakeholders in shaping of the future. So basically, when we talk about smart city, what we are doing currently is that for Cyberjaya to be a living lab, we test all cases, pain points, so that it can be implemented throughout the city. So this is our approach when it comes to smart city. It's actually one of the two pillars that we're focusing on, is that smart city and also our living lab program.
The living lab speaks to me a lot. I like what that does optically in my head when we think about that sort of opportunity to test and learn and scale.
Right.
You mentioned citizen centricity, and Dr. Rosida, I'm genuinely intrigued as to how we can encourage, and in your role as MAMPU, how do we encourage Malaysians, the rakyat, to contribute and to engage in that conversation more so?
Okay, thank you, Michael. Actually, in developing a smart city, we indirectly creating a smart community where the government extensively use the technology to interact with the government. In order to deliver the extensive value, the services provided by the government is not based only the latest technology available. However, it's based on the rakyat needs, the citizen need. This is a citizen-centric services. Thus, we need a citizen engagement or participation, which is a two-way communication to get the rakyat points of view and also their pain points toward the decision making later on. Actually, government has started off the engagement process by providing a platform, e-participation platform for the rakyat to contribute ideas as well as give feedback on the digital government.
Fabulous. I think the concept of creating that sort of virtuous circle between innovation, regulation, and then activation, the testing and the learning cycle. Adam, it strikes me, and I sort of stalked you on LinkedIn way before this conversation just to see just the amount of time that you contributed to communities and sustainability and most latterly the sort of last 10 years or so on government agendas. Can you talk us through a little bit on the regulatory frameworks that you've seen, not just in your backyard, but that really enable that sort of technology adoption?
Absolutely. I think as we have been able to confirm and identify those key barriers, Michael, to smart cities success, we've been able to learn and fold that into policy and other regulatory frameworks that that aspire to accelerate deployment. Because even though the technology exists, technology's never been the barrier. It's typically other horizontal issues, whether it might be procurement, funding and financing. We still see a lot of behaviours and mindsets internally within organisations that present a barrier to sort of scaling and replication of solutions. So I think we're at a point as a global smart cities community and movement where the barriers are very well known, and we're starting to see that play out in new and emerging policy. Just in our backyard here in Australia, in New South Wales, a new smart infrastructure policy has been released by the New South Wales state government, and that sees every infrastructure project in the state, which is funded by government, over $10 million, requiring a minimum level of technology and data solution embedment into whether it's buildings, libraries, roads, rail, bridges, or tunnels. So you see, globally leading policy like that, not only going quite a substantial way in accelerating solution deployment, but what you see there, which is potentially even more exciting, is the opportunity to catalyze a marketplace, really grow an ecosystem. And when you've got an infrastructure pipeline of about 300 billion Australian dollars for the New South Wales government, you can see that for the next 5 to 10 years, that state is, and that government is going to really have some great foundations to enable smart solution deployment, learn and continue to evolve their policy. So we're starting to see some very exciting policy and regulatory frameworks starting to emerge. And I could point to many regions around the world. I was in India, Bangalore, late last year. I met with about 75 cities there. We're seeing some fantastic policy emerge, likewise throughout Europe and other great leading regions of the world. So it took some time, but we're starting to see some good policy and regulation now responding to our key barriers.
And I presume, Najib, your budget isn't quite the same as what Adam just described New South Wales's budget is. But from a policy setting perspective, is there things that you are looking for to make sure specifically that the benefits on any particular effort that you might be investing time into from an infrastructure or a use case solution, how do we capture those benefits? How do we make sure that we're shouting from the rooftops that we've done what we said we wanted to do and we've exceeded our targets?
Okay. Well, basically, when we talk about development of cyber, it's always about collaboration. So currently, Cyberview, we are collaborating with parties, be it government agencies or be it the private sectors, to be able to roll out some initiatives here in Cyberjaya. For instance, recently we have rolled out these to recognize one of the three clusters in Cyberjaya, namely smart healthcare, smart mobility, and digital creative. And all these clusters is actually located in south of Cyberjaya. If you've been to Cyberjaya, you'll basically there's four distinctive zones in Cyberjaya. North part of Cyberjaya, where we have all these commercials and thriving commercial community there. We have South Cyberjaya, we have all this innovation district. West Cyberjaya, we have all these universities and colleges and whatnot. And not to mention about our downtown, where we have these thriving commerce districts. So coming back to your question, Michael, for instance, we have, in terms of infrastructure, we have rolled out what we call this our 5G Open Lab. Okay, thus far, with our 5G Open Lab, we are currently collaborating one of the telcos here in Malaysia. So we use a mid-range spectrum, trying to enable application of test cases. At the moment, we have around 23 use cases at our 5G Open Lab. And this is where we try and to roll out how we can use 5G technology to be able to enhance the penetration of technology in our daily life. Yeah. So this is one, is our collaboration with the private sector. We are also working closely with the city council in Sepang. We have identified what we call this route for autonomous vehicle as well. But nonetheless, some of this new technology, when we implement or when to roll out this technology, we need to have what we call a regulatory, how to get it to pass through the regulation. You can't run an autonomous vehicle on the road, on the public road, without getting necessary permits and things like that. So in Cyberjaya, also we have what we call this NRS, National Regulatory Sandbox, run by our subsidiary called Futurize. So by having this, we can use a lot of this new technology, for instance, like drone, autonomous vehicles and whatnot, and we'll be able to roll it out throughout the city. So that's why we focusing Cyberjaya as a living test, is as a living lab, whereby a lot of people from far and wide they can come in and test their use cases here in Cyberjaya. So they will be able to, for one, is that let's test it out. It's just a new technology, let's test it out in Cyberjaya. And then from Cyberjaya, it can be a catalyst where we can roll it out to nationwide. So this is where we are looking for in Cyberjaya.
And I mean, just to I suppose go back to the question as well. Do you put yourself under the pressure to genuinely represent the benefits, and is equally important an opportunity, to your point around the living lab and the testing and the opportunities that you present for players? Is that mostly the benefit that you're striving towards, that opportunity, as opposed to dollars and cents that people might start measuring you against in the short term?
Okay. So it's all about getting the community to support new technology. 2 years back already, almost 3 years back, we roll out what we call this fintech using cashless. We basically promote use of cashless community here in Cyberjaya. So when we roll out this, we work with some of the banks and financial institutions. At first, it's quite difficult for people to get through this. But then again, once we roll it out citywide and people find the benefit of using technology. So Cyberview, basically, our role here is actually to promote usage of technology. It can be used throughout the at least the city of Cyberjaya, but also we want it to be, used throughout the country. So as far as Cyberjaya is concerned, we want to be the catalyst, the capital of creation when it comes to technology. We invite a lot of R&D companies, we invite a lot of investors. Let's come and invest in Cyberjaya and use Cyberjaya as your test bed and hub before you roll out throughout the country. So this is how we look at how we can benefit from this initiative.
No, a lot of that resonates with me, right? Just having the opportunity to test, as you say, and learn is fundamental. And I suppose some of those learnings might relate to, perhaps, David, the sort of unintended consequences, right? So, we also as leaders need to be prepared to consider the effect on security or indeed the data that gets thrown off in this particular environment. How do you, David, from a technology and from perhaps even your views on the sort of regulatory side, how do we mitigate against those unintended consequences?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at Malaysia, and I think as everyone in the call kind of knows, we just recently launched the Malaysian Cybersecurity Strategy Framework, right? I think that's one step in the right direction to looking at all things national from a cybersecurity perspective. I think from where Cyberview is and their role in terms of testing, and I think there's a lot of learnings that we can do there, right? And I kind of alluded to an earlier, what I talked about was that security. I think we need to make sure that even when we're testing it, how do we actually embed security into a lot of these new services within a smart city context? Because I think there's a lot of excitement and hype around making sure that the products work and all that without thinking about security. And then at the point when you kind of slot it in, the application suddenly starts, kind of not work as expected because we never really thought about it. That's one end of the aspect of it to your question, right? I think the other part of it as leaders really is to think about, as a lot of these technologies in smart city goes into production, how do we now think about in terms of having a incident response plan around it, right? Because bad things are going to happen. It's not an if, it's just when it's going to happen. Does the city even have the ability to recover itself quickly, right? I think we all have kind of personally experienced how the whole water situation affected us. And that was in the real world. I mean, imagine that in a cyber world, in a smart city, has got very real consequences and implications to our life from a smart city perspective.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And I, we lack in this 2D virtual world. I suppose we somewhat lack those sort of social cues. But I did notice both Najib and Adam, you were both nodding around that security topic. So I'll come to you, Adam, first, but I'll go to you as well, Najib, after this. Have you gone through, particularly in your sphere of influence, that sort of security hiccup? And is there any, lightning bolts of insight that you can share with us?
Well, in terms of incidents, I think, and that's the thing with security, right? In the past, it has always been a knee-jerk reaction. So the whole industry is kind of littered with all these stories that you keep hearing about. And that's the interesting thing about security, right? Every single day, I've been doing this 15 years now, and it's always something new with it. I think the light bulb that I'm seeing slowly happen around this is one, how really intertwined our digital lives and our physical lives are, right? Down to even this concept of, and if you want to read about it, it's called digital twins, right? How intertwined our lives are around this, and I think the light bulb moment is kind of coming to almost every conversation out there. You need to secure it, you need to have it, but how do we kind of go about it, reimagining it? And I'm slowly starting to see the fact that we are not taking security and doing like a point product technology and putting a band-aid patch over it, but really kind of taking this opportunity to think about it holistically from a platform approach, because without that's not going to work. So hopefully that light bulb is coming on.
No, that resonates. Adam, have you got insights from across the ocean, as it were?
Michael, we've had some pretty significant cyber attacks nationally over the past 12, 18 months that have been sort of very public in that they've been announced and disclosed by relevant institutions. Our Prime Minister has even come out and announced that our nation has, succumbed to breaches, with critical infrastructure. So what's interesting to see is cyber and the threat of attacks has started to become a little bit more of a public topic. And that's a strategic move to raise awareness within the community. What is interesting is this sort of dilemma that we have. We talk about data is the new oil. I mean, data is the most abundant resource on Earth right now. Yet it's the least used in terms of value being created. So I ask myself the question all the time: where are we going to be at with cyber when we actually work out how to use data and extract value from it? And whilst we may be opening data at the moment and doing some data sharing, we're not going to fully realize or monetize data until we get sort of data exchange practices happening where we start creating marketplaces and we actually do value data. So we are, I believe, year on year in this part of the world, in Australia and New Zealand, being exposed publicly more to more dialogue and discussion. This year, our Department of Home Affairs released what I think is an excellent national cyber strategy, and indeed the funding that the Australian government and particularly the New South Wales state government is putting behind cyber. The amounts of money is eye-watering. The New South Wales state government is seeking to be a global leader in cyber, if not the cyber leader in the Southern Hemisphere. So Australia is going all out on cyber and building up policy, regulatory frameworks, and of course resourcing behind all of that to make sure that we sort of secure our data and our critical infrastructure in a way that positions us for greater prosperity and productivity going forward.
And David, just back to you, is that obviously resonates heavily, right? I mean, just the ambition that Adam talked about is, the word eye-watering evokes enough imagery for us to consider. Is there enough being done in your minds? Obviously, you need to tread a fine line here, but is there enough being done here and perhaps what is the call to action on that cyber topic for you?
I think firstly, just simply with the fact that we renewed and I think reimagined in terms of our Malaysian cybersecurity strategy, that's I feel in a step in that right direction, right? To kind of give all of us, here in Malaysia, that vision in terms of where we want to go. And of course, the backing of it in terms of implementing some of the strategies that has been mentioned around that. And I think in part, one of the things we've done with that is to make sure that, the talent ecosystem, we're fully engaged in that, right? Recently on the MDEC event, we signed a virtual MOU for training new cybersecurity talent in that sense. So in terms of more can be done, I think when it comes to security, with just the sheer pace of change with technology, we need to keep up with it, and that's where security really is, to make sure that's embedded in there. It's never a day's end of work, right? It's always running, it's always churning in that sense. So, but the fact that we've got that strategy in place, we've got a target, and that constant dialogue and discussion with government and stakeholders is going to be critical in this sense.
So, thank you, David. And Najib, just to round off the security topic, because I do want us to move on to data and the services that represents. But Najib, how are you dealing with, what was effectively a warning from Adam and his descriptions around what's happened to New South Wales government and the Prime Minister of Australia, and perhaps, to David's point, saying, yes, we're at a starting place, but we're moving forward. Are you finding yourself having to be ahead of it, even policy in this country, just to make sure that you're secure at Cyberview?
Actually, I have to qualify myself, because actually Cyberview, we are not cyber security specialists in this form. But what I can share with you, basically, Michael, is that in Cyberjaya, we have the cybersecurity agencies, government agencies currently housed in Cyberjaya. So as far as cybersecurity aspects concerned, we are working closely with those agencies to come out with the hub for cybersecurity in Malaysia. So we're trying to bring like-minded people, companies, investors to come and open shops in Cyberjaya and to make it a hub to centralize all these cybersecurity issues, to attend to all cybersecurity issues. So we are working closely with them, but with regards to what our involvement in coming up with the policies and whatnot, basically we actually in collaboration with Cybersecurity Malaysia to come up with those policies and how we attend to those threats. And amazingly, during our conversation with them, because I believe David mentioned a bit about talent, during my engagement with Cybersecurity Malaysia, they mentioned that basically we do have the talent in Malaysia. You need to basically bring people from outside the country to be able to look into this. It's just a matter of for us to find the right method or methodology and how to address this threat. Because the threat of cybersecurity is actually globally, it's not just in Malaysia, but also it's actually something of concern for us globally.
No, I understand, and you're right. It doesn't matter who your neighbor is physically; it matters who your neighbor is, sort of logically, as it were, and what their intent is, and everything that might happen as a result of that. But let's change topics away from cyber, because not at all trying to bring it down to anything other than the articulation of their future, right? The title of the panel. And it'll lead us into the data topic, I'm sure. But Dr. Rosida, how do we ensure that everyone, urban, rural, etc., get access to the sort of digital initiatives, the smart city initiatives, so that we can throw off the data?
Well, for me, a smart city basically is a city that capable to deliver information and services online. The communication infrastructure, name it wireless or wired, must be fully ready to address this urban challenge. With referring to the one study done by the Ministry of Communication and Multimedia on the gap analysis of communication infrastructure and readiness for the smart city implementation, actually we government is still striving to bridge the digital gap for the urban and rural areas. And the communication infrastructure is expected to be ready by the year 2022. And another challenge for me is part of infrastructure readiness is also performance. The performance of the communication infrastructure. And as a strategic intervention, actually government has set up a strategic intervention to reduce the digital gap. Actually, government has set up and expand such initiatives such as develop a Wi-Fi community, internet center. We also have a pusat internet desa, and recently with the collaborative with the private sector, we have a national digital infrastructure plan, or we call it Jendela.
So that'll do a huge amount to establishing connectivity and infrastructure services. And I suppose the question, and Adam, you raised this earlier around data. I'd like to explore that a little bit more, because it's such a nebulous concept. How do you're standing on your pulpit, how do you describe how people might think about data in a smart city environment?
Michael, the smart city, as we've been referring to it for 8 years at the Smart Cities Council, is one that uses technology and data to accelerate sustainability and livability outcomes. Those two elements, technology and data, have always been key, and one without the other sort of doesn't work. I think there has been a focus on technology over the past 5 to 10 years, and I think, if anything, 2020 is the real watershed moment where, particularly given the global recession and health pandemic, that the value of data really started to become a sort of realization for many cities and other organizations. Having the availability of those insights when we most needed them, when our communities and businesses were shutting down, having access to insights was was critical. And for those that didn't have a data program or didn't invest in data, we saw that they were ones that were really heavily hit. So I think we're going to sort of go into 2021 with a greater appreciation for data, and that we will invest more in data, because data is intelligence and insights on what's going on. And for those that didn't have access to good, relevant data this year, it was very difficult to make the decisions quickly that we needed to help our communities rebound and recover. So I think the health pandemic alone has been a significant sort of agitator and, sort of platform by which data is starting to become valued a lot more. The problem is, as I mentioned, it's the largest resource, the most abundant resource on Earth, but it's the most underutilized. So there's the big problem for me, which is converting data into insights and intelligence and making better decisions. We're getting better and better at gathering data, securing it, undertaking analytics. What we're not doing well at is converting that intelligence into better decision making that creates value for our community and for our businesses. And I have my fingers crossed that in the next sort of year to 3 years, as we come out post-COVID, that we will just naturally be a little bit more aware of the value of data. But we need to have some really, I think, important supporting mechanisms. And whilst people often criticize the work that was undertaken in Toronto by Google and Sidewalk Labs at the Quayside development, one thing that project did leave us with as a legacy is some excellent work around civic data trusts. And this is where we have formal platforms and mechanisms and governance arrangements in place that ensure that the value of data is distributed more equitably. So I think there's some great emerging tools like civic data trusts on the back of COVID and a greater realization on the value for data that positions us all globally over the next 5 to 10 years to finally realize the value that data can bring to our communities and businesses.
Yeah, no, I read about that civic side of it, and it's fascinating how sometimes you stumble into a good outcome with the context not being quite the same. Najib, how do we become the poster child within Cyberview and responsibly, but still present and publish and expose the very powerful and beneficial data perhaps that you're collecting, the drone environment or the autonomous vehicle environment? How do we expose that to developers and third parties, private or indeed government alike, responsibly? How do you go about doing something like that?
Okay, just to share, over at our office in Cyberjaya, we have what we call these common integrated platforms. From this common integrated platform, we harvest data from multiple sources, inclusive of from building, energy, traffic, autonomous vehicle, usage of telecommunication via our LoRa networks and whatnot. So we have all these database here that we capture for Cyberjaya community. So from this data, basically, for instance, also we have this one data to capture about the propensity to spend for people when they come in and want to buy buildings and they look at the rental rate in Cyberjaya. So all this data we have captured here for Cyberjaya. Now, in terms of sharing, at the moment we have not shared this data with other external parties. We are just use it to make things better for us. For instance, like we control the traffic in Cyberjaya. So we look at how many people that pass through the junction and think like how long it takes for them to pass through the junction. So we use data just for our own consumption to make things better and more effective in Cyberjaya. But as far as sharing those data with other external parties, we have yet to go to that phase yet, because we look at the data that we have also is about consumer trend in Cyberjaya, and then the amount of money that we should spend on things. So all these things is captured under this fintech platform and whatnot. So as far as we have not churned out the data and work with people, we have not used the big data analytic to review the data and things like that. But at the moment, we just use it for our consumption to make things more better and efficient in Cyberjaya, so to speak.
No, and I think that reflects the stage of the progress, right? As you evolve and get more confident and comfortable and be more responsible about how we potentially do that, we might see, the sort of hackathons of the future.
Definitely.
Data sets anonymized, obfuscated, nice complicated word for effectively anonymization. But David, from a technology provider perspective, how do you ensure that it's captured and stored and looked after? I mean, that falls firmly on your plate, doesn't it, from a responsibility perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from a security perspective, right? And that's why I think we want to try to empower organizations, right, out there that's using data. But if you look at data, I guess the way it's kind of getting consumed is a lot of the data and telemetry is getting pushed up to a massive cloud data lake platforms, right? Because developing anything on-prem in your own environment, it's just going to be a bunch of, a big headache around that. But so the moment you kind of push it out to cloud providers, that has the ability to ingest this a massive amount of telemetry coming in. And that's where the concept of shared responsibility comes in, which all the cloud players kind of tout, and even we do as well. To look at it that infrastructure-wise, yes, we will take care of the data, but the responsibility of making sure that data is secure and who has got access to it is ultimately, again, the responsibility of the end users, right? And to the point around where a lot of this data and telemetry is being stored, and I can go back to history, and we've actually seen real-world attacks that happen on these data sets, right? And I give you a classic case of even Uber, not Uber, it was Tesla, right? Their vehicles, the telemetry was all being pushed up onto a public cloud platform. A simple misconfiguration of that cloud platform provider exposed the entire data set out. So you can imagine the nightmare that kind of ensued towards that. So from a technology point of view, from our perspective, yes, we definitely have the technologies to give you that visibility, which I've talked about. Where does your data really reside? Who has got access to it, and how that's being used? And it kind of cuts across, the popular cloud providers that are kind of going out there and saying that, hey, look, we can ingest all the telemetry for you. We can analyze the data, put machine learning analytics on it. But what use is that when the data itself is compromised, right? By simple misconfiguration of it. There's one aspect of it that from a security perspective, kind of want to talk about. But on the other hand, how we are kind of approaching it from our perspective as well is that, so within Palo Alto Networks, we've got this massive data lakes, right? And the way we kind of look at it is that we are not keeping the data all to ourselves. Security, cybersecurity has gone down this route of the more telemetry we have, it's considered intellectual property, but that's actually changing. We're trying to expose our data sets out to our partners as much as possible. And when it comes to IoT, right, we're getting massive amount of telemetry from IoT from a security perspective that's coming up into our data lakes. So now the question is, how do we expose? And we have APIs exposed to partners to actually come onto the platform, develop unique applications that can actually use the data sets that our devices are actually picking up from an IoT perspective, our firewalls, the endpoint itself, that's all going into this massive data lake. So a lot of that work has been taken. We secure it. We secure it for the users, they generating themselves, but how are we also thinking in terms of democratizing that data out for research purpose, right? Yeah.
Which potentially raises that specter of monetization. Adam, let me just throw the last question to you. Given the increased access to that data, how do governments and third parties responsibly monetize? What's your experience on that? You've
Michael,
got a minute.
yeah, I don't think we are at a level of maturity of monetizing data yet. That's my response. We're opening data, we're sharing data, we're still yet to exchange data in an open marketplace that will put a value on a data set and a data asset. We're seeing little bits of it. Some sectors do it really well. The stock exchange, data fuels that entire sector for our cities and communities. I don't think we're at that level of maturity of effectively at scale monetizing data.
Thank you for that, Adam. I'd hoped that you would have ended there with a bit of a gauntlet throwdown to everyone involved in smart cities, because look, it's important for me to thank you all as the panel. Adam, David, Najib, Dr. Rosida, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. We covered a lot of ground. We covered the security topic. We covered the monetization of data right at the end. But perhaps the thing that spoke most to me as we were going through to this is, sure, we need to get the infrastructure right. And Dr. Rosida, you talked a lot about the investment, Jindala and otherwise. But what that will enable is the thing perhaps that we need to focus on next. That new gold, that new oil, that most abundant resource, Adam, that you refer to as well, data. On that note, I'd like to thank you all very much. I hope you have a fabulous set of days, and goodbye to all of you watching from home.